right. Hey there, Sarah and Chelsea Stier, joining you for a bit of a special video today. As I mentioned last week in our behind the scenes live, we've got more time to achieve one of our big goals here in the community, and that's connection and wanting to show up and talk about what's happening in the industry and talk about what's going on with you guys. And Chelsea and I just recently watched the KeHE State of the Industry video. It was available on YouTube, and we have thoughts and we have things that we want to share with you because I think it's important information, some of the things that they were talking about.
Yeah, I think so too. And, I really want to start things off, Sarah, because for everyone in the community that does know me, I have worked in the food industry pretty much my whole life, really more on like the restaurant and service side of the industry. And so I don't have a whole lot of experience with distribution and distributors. Even when I worked for Starbucks, everything was self-distributed within the company. So look, I know who KeHE is. I know they're a distributor. I know kind of like what a distributor does, but I was hoping you could just explain to me a little bit more about who KeHE is as a business, what are they known for, and kind of get me up to speed a little bit.
I think you know more than you're letting on, but I think this is a great question because there are so many founders in this community who aren't yet selling through distribution. And when you anytime, like anyone in the food industry, if you haven't done it yet, you probably don't know anything about it. There's like a lot of unknowns in this industry, right? So I think the simplest way to break it down is to talk about how you can sell your product and where distribution comes in, and then what the role of a distributor is. So pretty much everybody, not everyone, but like the vast majority of founders and businesses are going to start by selling direct to consumer. So that's a relationship where you are selling directly to the person who's going to consume your product. I like to think of it as like no middlemen in between you and the person who's going to eat your product, right? Then you have a relationship that I call wholesale direct, and a lot of people might call direct. You are selling to a retailer, and then that retailer is going to sell your product to the end consumer. So that has one middleman, right, in that relationship between you and your customer. That relationship can be really successful on a regional basis, right, where you might be able to deliver, by vehicle to the stores that are going to sell your product. You might even ship your product to a retailer who's maybe across the country or a few states away. Once you get to a certain phase of your business or a certain size and you want to start selling into bigger stores, they're going to require you to work with the distributor. The reason this is because the bigger the store, the more products they're dealing with. That means the more brands that they're going to have to reach out to place their order, send payments to, right? It just becomes a sort of like paperwork and logistical nightmare to manage all of these products and SKUs. So they enlist the help of a distributor to help to streamline that process. So you, as the brand founder, will actually sell your product to a distributor, and it'll go to the distributor's warehouse. And when a retailer that you're working with orders your product, it will be delivered to them by the distributor. And then once it's on the retail shelf, right, it can then be sold to your consumer. So in a distribution relationship, there's sort of two middlemen between you and, the end consumer of your product. And the reason they exist is to streamline the supply chain specifically to the retailer who's buying a lot of products and selling a lot of products on their shelf. So they play a very important role really in getting food around the country.
Yeah. Okay. And so when we're talking about KeHE, what would you say they're known for? Like, what retailers do they typically or are known to have relationships with? Tell me a little bit about them.
Yeah. So KeHE is one of the players in what we would call the like natural and specialty space.
Okay.
UNFI is another player in this space. So I think a lot of brands within this community might be familiar with those two names. KeHE works with Whole Foods in some cases, but so do a lot of other distributors. They're also a distributor for Sprouts. There's who else? They've got a lot of regional relationships as well. We've got some folks in Oklahoma. I guess there's a chain there called Reese's, which I'm not familiar with personally, but KeHE is a distributor for that retailer as well. There's really probably thousands of different retail stores and chains that KeHE works with, but those are some of the bigger names on sort of a national and then obviously on a regional level.
Awesome.
Yeah. And I think, primarily I'll add that they've been known to distribute consumer packaged goods versus a distributor who might focus on fresh produce, right?
Okay.
Or like, items with a very short shelf life. I think the majority of what KeHE moves is more shelf stable. Not all, like jams and jellies and stuff. They do have refrigerated products. They do have things with a bit of a shorter shelf life, but their specialty, I think, is a bit more shelf stable.
Okay. So Sarah, I know that we've both watched this video now. I keep wanting calling it the State of the Union, but the State of the Industry that KeHE put out last week. And I was introduced for the first time to Deb Conklin, the new president at KeHE. Do you know how long has she been in role now as president? And then I kind of want to get into the conversation because I thought it was a really good one or interesting one.
Yeah. Don't quote me on this, but I think she just stepped into the role this year for sure. That is a fact. It may have been in January. She's been, just a few months. I remember during the State of the Industry, I think she mentioned like what she had done in her first 160 days.
Yeah, I remember that.
Yeah. And I know that she has, taken over the role of president after a gentleman who goes by the first name Brandon, I don't know his last name, was in the role for 15 years. So It was really lovely. He kind of introduced her at the beginning of the presentation that we watched. What I think is interesting, and one of the reasons that I was really eager to watch this, is because there's been a lot of talk on LinkedIn about Deb.
Okay.
Which is something that I find really interesting. And I think maybe some of the folks here in this community may have seen some of the conversations surrounding Deb online as well. And so I think it's important to talk a little bit about, KeHE and the fact that, to be quite frank, UNFI used to have a bit of a bad name in the distribution world as having a lot of like hidden fees and chargebacks, and sort of, they had a reputation that kind of preceded them. And in recent months, I know I can think about it dating back to like August of last year, KeHE has kind of been taking over that position in the industry by way of some things that have been reported about how they do business. We had Modest Coffee on the podcast and we talked about it, and they were very open with, about their story, and that KeHE was their distributor and some of the difficulties they've had. We've had kind of behind the scenes conversations with some of our customers and advisors, who say, sort of watch out for KeHE. And in particular, what I was kind of talking about on LinkedIn is a gentleman, and I'm not going to share any specific details, but who had a bad experience with KeHE. He shared his side of the story and was asking KeHE to do better, which I think is an important thing to do, right? Share realities of kind of what's happening in the industry.
And
but
I just want to interrupt and say, like, of course, as a brand, when, these partnerships, right, with these distributors, like you mentioned with Modest Coffee and some other businesses that we know of, when it's the life or death of your business, of course, you're going to have personal stakes in that, and you're going to have very strong opinions and emotions about the way that the business is done.
Yeah.
I think that's totally understandable.
And it's important to share those stories because we need other founders to hear those stories so they have an awareness of what has happened before, so that you don't enter into a relationship blindly. I'll say, after that conversation happened, we've had brands that I work with as a consulting CFO on board with KeHE, so it's not, and that's why I bring this up, because it's not like this bad thing happened to someone and so now no one should ever work with KeHE or insert name of distributor, in the industry. It's about having an awareness, what questions to ask, what to look out for, and learning from other people's misunderstandings or missteps or traumatic experiences, and I think that that's why people share them.
And so I want to get back to this post you were talking about on LinkedIn. Yeah. You said that this gentleman was upset about the way his partnership had been handled.
Yeah. I think there was it seemed like maybe there wasn't a great partnership, or things weren't moving in a retail relationship. KeHE was the distributor. They had somewhat constructive conversation, but then suddenly it was like the ties were cut and business sort of ended. And of course, as you're saying, like, this is massive, this is important, and it needs to be talked about, if this is what had happened to the brand, so other brands and founders can be aware. But as a part of that conversation, Deb stepping in as the new president, I'm calling her Deb as if I know her personally. I do not. I hope to meet her someday soon. It was like, hey, Deb, we want you to do better, but I doubt that you will. And that was a tough thing to see, and to kind of read and to see people sort of gang up on a person who was stepping into a role at an organization who maybe hadn't done the best in every single instance. Which, what organization that's as large as KeHE can be perfect all the time? So that was like another reason that I felt I really wanted to sit down and watch this state of the industry and listen to her talk. As you asked, and I mentioned, I think she's been in the role for about 6 months now. And so let's give her a chance. Let's hear, what she has to say. And hope that things will change, and invite her to have conversations with us and this part of the food industry. And that will kind of, as we talk about what she talked about, I think that that's going to be an important thing to do. So that's a little tease
I definitely agree with you. And I also think, going off of what you're saying, right, is a big part of our mission here is to change the way food business is done, right? Yep. And that means changing the way that these companies do food business. Mm-hmm. And I think that a really important piece of that is that we can't change the way that food business is done, and we can't change the way that these companies do food business unless we believe that they can change.
Yeah.
And
I think we need to give them the opportunity to change. And I think the step that comes before that is conversations and transparency, right? Which is something that we also talk about a lot here. I was very pleasantly surprised to see was a part of this conversation, as we're going to get into. Yeah, totally.
Yeah. Okay. So let's dive into it. I want to hear from you, and I'll share too some of the things that really stood out for me. Again, it's been over a week since I watched it, so you might have to remind me on a couple things. But I thought there was a lot that was really interesting about this conversation. And I think, just to kick us off, one of the things that I loved just watching and see how they pulled the information together was how much information and conversation there was around the consumer, right? When we talk about the state of the industry, right? That's driven by the state of the consumer.
Yeah. I think so. Going back to sort of how the relationships work, right? When when you think about that, a food brand sells their product to KeHE, who then sells their product to the retailer. That retailer sells to the consumer. This is a relationship in which everyone really needs to succeed, right?
Mhm.
And so that's an important thing to remember, because when KeHE talks about their customer, they're talking about the retailer, right? The person who's buying from them. But one of the things I really liked early on in her presentation was that she talked about the importance of the brands, the importance of the producer, many of whom, and I'm sort of paraphrasing what she said, many of whom are entrepreneurs. They are
Yeah.
creating a product that has purpose. They are creating businesses that have purpose, and they are the lifeblood of KeHE and KeHE's success, because without brands and without successful brand partnerships, they have nothing to sell to their customers. And this, I think, is extremely important, because it's how it's the point at which we come to the table together as a brand and a distributor and say, how do we really truly make this work? Right.
Yeah.
And when we think about the fact that everyone in this community who is a food brand, a food founder, is a good food founder, and that KeHE is one of the major players in the natural and specialty food space, which is this space that we are in. This is of the utmost importance that they get it right for us, and that we understand, and how they need to do business, where brands need to be in order to work with them to create this very successful and like symbiotic relationship
Yeah.
across the supply chain.
Yeah. I agree, definitely.
So that was a really interesting thing. And you said the other things about the consumer. She really sort of drew a line for us about some of the changes that happened like as a result of COVID. It was sort of like a starting point.
Yeah, I thought that was so interesting. I loved that she really took us all the way back and started from what things changed for consumers during COVID, right?
Mhm.
And what I loved about it was that she, like you said, she really drew that line to now, because I think, at some point, every single one of us has thought at some point things are going to get back to normal in the
Mhm.
future. There's some future time when business will get back to normal, our routines will get back to normal, habits will get back to normal. And that has not happened, and it's not going to happen, right?
Yeah.
We are forever changed. The industries, not just the food industry, but industries are forever changed. And I really liked seeing how she laid that out and showed us how consumer habits have changed, retail habits have, the way that we do business has changed. And I also really liked, there was a moment where she said, I can't predict the future.
Yeah.
I don't know if this, I think she was specifically at that moment talking about what something that I know we'll get into, which is the outside food at home, right? So
Mhm.
like a delivery service that a lot of consumers are using.
Yeah.
And she showed that there has been growth in that still, even after COVID.
Yeah.
And she said, and I can't predict if that is a trend that's going to continue, or if that will return, to numbers closer to pre-COVID.
Yeah.
So I liked that openness, that open-mindedness to, we are going to find a way to serve everyone, which I know also we're going to talk about.
Yeah.
But that like a little bit showed me that she's really thinking holistically.
Yeah. Well, so a couple of the interesting things that she pointed out in some of the charts that she had, as you mentioned, the like, you know, eh, during the very early days of COVID, and I don't remember, I can't say specifically like how many months or like how long it was, but particularly out here in LA, right? We had like a shutdown of restaurants. So food away from home plummeted, and food like purchased for in the home, right? And food prepared in the home, money spent there was really high. And then you had this point in time where, and I know I went through this, where I was like, I'm so tired of thinking about, and I just felt like I
Yeah.
was making food and cleaning dishes all the time. And I was kind of like wiped out from it. So then as restaurants opened, even though people weren't fully back to work and things weren't kind of open across the country, to the fullest, people were now getting food that would typically be eaten away from home and bringing it home, but by way of like delivery service. And one might have thought, oh, well, this will die down once things open back up again, but we haven't seen that. So food typically eaten outside of the home is still being delivered to the home and consumed at home at high numbers, much higher than, you know, the early days of COVID and certainly before COVID. She also built into that conversation, or as an extension of that conversation, supply and demand, supply chain, and inflation, right? And so inflation was at 7% and then 6.5% in 21 and 22 respectively, and has dropped a bit now. According to her chart, it was 4.9% in 2023. So one of the things she said is, I'm not going to predict what is going to happen with inflation or deflation, or if things are going to stay steady at this like kind of 4.9%. I don't know. And I can't predict, and nobody can. Like like no one can agree on what they think is going to happen. But what we know for sure is that today the consumer dollar doesn't go as far as it used to. If you took $100 to the grocery store, you might still take $100 now, but it's going to buy you fewer things. And that's important to stop on, because what that means is less number of products are leaving the store. That affects the retailer, that affects the distributor, and that affects the brands that people are buying, right? Or no longer able to buy, because you're having to make choices. That said, one of the things that she talked about in consumer behaviors is that there is this treat yourself mentality that I think holds true during a recession, where you will buy the little things that feel like treats to bring home. And that in the specialty and natural food space, people are brand loyalists. And so, you know, for people are loyal and people will continue to buy the products. They may not buy it as frequently because that $100 doesn't go as far, but they won't abandon it completely. And I think that that's something else that's important, you know, to keep in mind about the consumer.
Yeah. Should we talk about, you made me think about this when you were kind of diving into more consumer behaviors. I'd love to break down this other thing that she talked about throughout, I think, the conversation, right? Or throughout her address, which was an emphasis on really how many different types of consumers there are now.
Yeah.
And how balanced that is.
Yeah.
And so, you know, one thing I love that she talked about is like, we can't just cater to X consumer, right?
Yeah. See, I find this very interesting, and I have mixed thoughts on this, to be quite honest with you, right? Because we hear a lot of, so I'll share a little bit more about what she said. So what she said was that the consumer is dramatically changing. I'm sort of like reading from my notes here. I was like frantically like taking notes and pausing. I had captions on while I was watching. I was very into it. But she said that the working population is now made up of 25% baby boomers, 33% Gen X, and 35% millennials. And each of these groups behaves and consumes things very differently, right? So they have slightly different values. They have different very different values in some cases. They have different ways of interacting. They have different ways of consuming, right? They want different products and different things. And she talked about needing to be able to, I'll say, cater to, right, or meet each of these demographics where they are. And I thought that was very interesting. And I'd actually love sort of like a brand strategist's opinions and thoughts on this, because I think a lot of what I hear anyway is that you have to find your niche. You have to find your consumer, right, and get very dialed in with them and offer them the product that they want, and don't try to be everything to everyone. So I thought it was pretty interesting that she was effectively saying you can't, as she literally said, you can't be a one-trick pony. You can't just be one thing for one group. And that was one of the things where I was like, I wonder if this will kind of be true, or is this really true? And what does someone with marketing and sort of brand experience think about this?
Yeah, I would also be interested to hear what an expert would say about that, because I think from the perspective of, we are a distributor, right? And so we're distributing, like our job is to ensure the movement of product into multiple retail spaces.
Yeah.
And so that their customer kind of really is all over the place, right?
Yes.
Because everybody buys groceries, everybody, and you do have people across generations and across demographics, right? That all do shop in these kind of specialty food stores.
Yeah.
And so for them, it's like, it would be, I would imagine, harder to narrow down to one consumer category, because with the numbers that you just shared, right, it is very balanced.
Yeah.
Even across generations.
Well, I think what we're saying here, if I can jump in, is that KeHE's customer is all three of those, and KeHE can't be a one-trick pony, and KeHE can't just work with one type of brand, right? But I don't know that trickles all the way back to the individual brands, right?
Absolutely.
That each of those individual brands really needs to be everything to everyone.
Yeah.
I think KeHE has a job and a responsibility to source products that then meet the needs of all of their customers across these.
And I think also, you're making me think about a lot of this stuff, right? Because when we start to get and talk about some of the things that they are implementing, right, and things that they are doing, I think you're absolutely right, that the job that KeHE has ahead of them is to have the right partnerships, right? And move the right products to the right places. And so they are the strategic piece, right, in the supply chain. And so that's, I think, why all of this is so important to them, and having a conversation about the state of the industry, right?
Yeah. Exactly. So let's talk about a couple of other things that she said about the consumer, and these, as she, talked about these three sort of generations of consumer, right? That are, one is the food at home versus the food away from home. There's different trends with that among the different generations, right? And if you just think about, my parents don't do DoorDash or like Uber Eats or any of those things. I don't either, but I'm a weirdo, right? In that I know what the financials of a food business are, and I know how much money goes to those apps. And so I just personally don't support them. I go directly to the source. Yeah. But there are a lot of people who don't want to have an interaction with people, right? I think the younger generations, they just want to kind of go to the app and have sort of a seamless transaction. So across those three, generations, how much food is consumed or, made at home versus how much is consumed out of the home and or delivered, that's very different, right? So it's a great example of that.
And I would even extrapolate that or extend that to grocery delivery.
Yeah, exactly.
That's a great point. Not just meal delivery.
Yep. Yeah. And for there to be supply chain success, right? If you think about all the parties involved, in order for there to be supply chain success, the stores that KeHE works with, if their clients, even 30% of them, want a seamless, sort of humanless, if you will, transaction where they order online and the groceries are delivered and they never have to see a person, it's in KeHE's best interest for the store to be equipped with that, right? But then also, what can KeHE do to support that and to help that, right? And to sort of meet the needs of a store who's going to be very tech savvy, and meeting that client, right?
Yeah.
Like where they want to be. It's a really great point, Chelsea. The other thing that she talked about, and this is sort of like different, because she had talked about how brand loyal people are. One of the things she said, though, was that a trend that's driving change is people looking for private label products within stores that they really trust. And so an example of this might be like a Whole Foods, right? Doing the 365, I think, is like their white label, private label organic product. She talked about how a lot of these private label products are good, and they're not necessarily like a lesser alternative, right? And so this is something that they are aware of as a distributor, because I don't know that KeHE is distributing an Amazon brand, right? Like a Whole Foods brand. So that's something that was, I think, on their mind, but also will trickle back to a brand and say, like, is my product something that has been white labeled or is white labeled or private labeled by the store? So I thought that was really interesting. The next thing on her list was, go ahead.
All I was going to say is I think it also creates a lot of opportunity.
Okay.
Right. From KeHE's perspective in terms of, creating opportunity for small brands to private label in those retail stores.
Maybe. Yeah. Depending on who, a lot about how the private label works. You know what I mean? Like how they contract that out. So an expert in our community who knows more about that.
But I would imagine.
Let us know.
Yeah.
Yeah. The other thing she talked about, sort of the second thing on her list that we hinted at earlier, was the demand for transparency, right? Which is like I was sort of like, finally, the general industry is like catching up. Yay. But she said, people are asking the question, are these companies operating sustainably? Are they operating in a planet friendly way? They want to know that the brands are aligned on a values level, and consumers are willing to pivot away from brands that aren't and toward brands that are. Obviously, as a good food, revolutionary, if you will, good food, movement supporter, we want this. We want people to be voting with their dollars and getting, asking for transparency and sustainable brands. I think where things can get a little bit tricky is with sort of like greenwashing, and I think we need to keep an awareness of, okay, if this is a trend that's on KeHE's radar now, it's been on big brand radars for a while. And so I don't know that, my hope is that people come and find the best sources for this, product, but I don't know, I don't know how long that will take. I don't know what that transition might look like.
I think a lot of that comes down to, again, like for us at the level we are, right, in the industry, it's just to continue having the conversation and highlighting the right kinds of brands, the right kinds of people, and getting the word out as much as possible.
Yeah. Continuing to do what
we're
the
doing.
Brands here in this community do. Exactly. Yeah. The third thing was seeking plant-based foods. And what she touched on here was, it wasn't necessarily, she didn't say like vegetarians and vegans are growing as a part of the population. What she said was there's this trend of non-vegan and vegetarians who are seeking out plant-based products as a way to, in her words, balance their diet.
Yeah. And I think we've seen this trend coming for a long time, right? Yeah. I think a lot of this is your everyday consumer really starting to understand and have the knowledge around the environmental impacts of meat production, the health impacts of consuming an all high protein or high meat diet. And people are making different choices now. Meatless Mondays, like we've been talking about meatless Mondays forever. Mm-hmm. So I think this is a trend that probably on our side of the industry, we are well aware of, but to see that it is catching up and it's a bigger part of the conversation is cool. Yeah.
Yeah. Need to learn more about the newest. They're not plant-based though, I guess, are they? They're the meat. lab meats. I guess
Yeah, I think
that's a whole
that's still
different
meat, right?
conversation.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that is
Yeah.
a
Yeah.
whole different conversation.
We'll save that for another day.
Yeah.
And then one of the last points was the focus on health and wellness. And I think that just drives back to what we were just talking about in terms of the plant-based products, but also, what is the quality of the ingredients going into the products? How
Mhm.
long is that ingredient list? Things of that nature, right? People who are health conscious, people who are planet conscious, right? They start to pay attention more to like what is going into the product. And I think that benefits the good food industry, and good food brands. And, one of the things she said was that the share of the natural and specialty products right now is 20%. And she didn't frame that as like within KeHE specifically, or if it
Mhm.
was like industry wide, but she stated that it was 20% and was certainly going to grow and be an area of growth. And so we'll kind of talk about their infrastructure and some of the things they're doing and sort of come back to that point, I think, to talk about what that could mean for our part of the industry, right? The one thing that she also touched on, and my notes for this are funny, and I'll share them. Underneath consumer behaviors and values, and I think that this goes back to I assume the fact that $1 or $100 doesn't go as far as it used to. She said that promotions are important, and she really kind of spent a bit of, not a lot of time here, but my notes
She
say
drove it home.
my notes say she loves a deal, and I think she talked about actually like how much she loves a deal. And so, one of the things she said was if it drives trial and then hopefully repeat business, right? That's obviously a great purpose for having a promotion. But then she said, or if it just makes you feel good about yourself and it's
Yeah.
important to you to be able to find a deal. She said, and this is a quote, being on the shelf promoting, being seen as someone who is attracting that type of consumer is incredibly important.
Mhm.
And I will be honest, I didn't love that. I
Yeah.
didn't love that. To me, what I instantly thought was promotions are going to be really important for relationships with this distributor. And I think a sort of an educational moment for anybody who is listening to this, who's maybe not working with the distributor yet or doesn't know exactly how this works. When a retail store has your product on promotion, that comes out of the brand's pocket. The store is not saying, hey, we're going to take 50 cents less per unit while your product is on sale. They're going to get their full amount. And by the way, KeHE is going to take their full amount for the product too. You are the one who are paying for the promotion. So it's 50 cents that you're giving up, on the sale of every one of your products that sell on promotion. So this has potentially big implications for
Yeah.
brands. And, as we're working behind the scenes to put together, the informational section about distributors and how they work and the fees and the promotions and the chargebacks and the expectations. And we're digging into KeHE, they have certain requirements and expectations, from how often you'll do promos to, what your kind of incentives up front are and various other
Yeah.
things. So this is something that I'll be keeping an eye on, through the work that we do with our clients, especially those who work with KeHE.
Yeah, as you should. And I would just add that I think this is, a perfect example of when we talk about bringing everyone to the table, right? And having those transparent conversations. Obviously, promotions are important, right? Especially for a new and emerging brand for all the reasons you listed around just like awareness, brand awareness,
Yeah.
and gaining that repeat business.
Yeah.
But at the same time, as you've said a million times, right? If we're going to run a promotion, how do we run a promotion that is beneficial to everyone?
Yeah.
And how do we broach that conversation in these partnerships?
Yeah. Something that I've really loved seeing behind the scenes since our episode with Gwen, Richardson aired is people coming to our coaching sessions, our office hours in the Revolutionary membership, and to one-on-one, sessions with my clients, building out those models that say, okay, here is the profitability of this particular customer, and how many promotions can I run, and what can those promotions be, and how will that affect the financial outcomes of this specific relationship. And then that, how does that trickle down into my overall financials for the business. So I think, yes, 100% is like transparency, but it starts with doing the work on your end as a brand to understand what works for you, and then communicating that to your partner in distribution. In this case, it might be KeHE or anyone else, really. I think it's a super important thing to do. We already talked about the treat yourself mentality that was here on the list. We talked a little bit about, they called it self-checkout and robotics was sort of the title of it on the presentation, but talking about like self-checkout, right? And like the importance of the ability to do that in store for their customers. But it's also the interfaces, right? The apps, the like, how can I get my groceries delivered, seamlessly to my house. The other interesting thing that she talked about here, I don't know if you remember this, you probably do, that the average 60% of the population is on social media. So that's number one.
I remember
Number two is that on average, this 60% of the population is on social media 2 hours a day. And lastly, and this was incredible, social media and online shopping, right? So when we think about online shopping, I think we often think about websites and going to an online store. But
or Amazon or whatever.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The amount of sales that have shifted to social media platforms is huge, and it's projected to be $3.37 billion by 2028.
Yeah.
Which I have down here is a 600% increase. I didn't write down the date for when that's an increase above, but it could be from like last year, right? Or maybe even 2021, depending on the data that they were using. But that's incredible.
Yeah, I do remember that. That blew my mind.
And the other thing that I think is really important is this idea that more people are finding brands on social media rather than in store.
Yeah. So let me ask you then, because it's not something that I think I've thought all the way through, but what is the implication there for a brand in our community, right?
Yeah. I think that's a really, really big question. And I think about it from time to time quite often, because social media is an algorithm based software, right? There's ways, it's like if someone who is favored within the algorithm uses your product in something, shares your product, big uptick in your ability, right, in your sales. And when a product then has a big popularity, what we see then is that more, especially boutique stores, will then latch on to that brand, bring it into the store, because they're following the trend. They're understanding, if this is popular on social media and someone walks into my store, they will likely buy it there.
Yeah.
I think that this is almost a side conversation as well, because I think that it extends into algorithms just across the industry on platforms like Fair and Mabel, right? And what are the implications of that, the good and the bad? So let's have another conversation about that.
Yeah.
Someday, because I think there's a lot to pull apart there for sure. But I think at the end of the day, you have to go where your core customer is and find them and connect with them somehow. And I don't think that it all has to happen on social media, despite this trend, right? And despite these statistics, I think that there are still people who are finding products in stores, maybe not in the standard big box store, because how many new products are being released there that, you know what I mean, that are the kind that our consumer
that you might find.
wants.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I want to jump to sort of the section of her presentation where she says, like, what are the effects on the food industry and like, what does the industry need to do? She used this example of Blockbuster. Do you remember that?
Yes, I do remember that.
So she talked about how, like, Blockbuster was not just a transaction, it was an experience.
Yeah.
And
You could
they owned.
hold
Yeah.
the movie. You could grab the popcorn. You could
Yeah.
smell.
You
Yeah.
would go as a family or as a
Yeah.
couple, right? Like it was the whole thing was the event all the way from like, from deciding to getting it home to like finishing the movie. Right. And she's like, Netflix was like, oh, okay, we can make this easier. We can make this a transaction. You can go online, you can order the thing and we'll ship it to your home. And then of course they expanded into what is now streaming, right?
You can just turn your television on.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's still very transactional. I mean, I'm sure you can make it an experience, but it's a transaction. And the reason she brought this up was because she talked about how Blockbuster was not prepared. And one of the things she said was that Blockbuster was not a student of the game, which like that made me go, okay, pause.
Yeah.
Because they had a good thing going, right? But they weren't aware, or at least they weren't aware enough of what was happening around them. How were things changing? The fact that, things were changing and they didn't try to evolve. They stayed the same.
I was going to say, I would argue that they were aware, right, of the changes that were happening in terms of the service, because they even started to offer a mailing service. Blockbuster did. I don't know if you remember that.
I don't.
That was a little bit like competing with Netflix, but I think where Blockbuster probably made a bigger mistake is not having a quick enough awareness to the consumer.
Yeah.
All the way to that end.
Yeah. Yeah. And so she shared that as sort of the foundational story of like, what does KeHE need to do differently? And so this is, I think, a really important part of the conversation here. So there were 3 things. Number 1 was fresh as a differentiator. So she talked a lot about this sensory experience idea and how a percentage of consumers want to have an experience. So I think there's pendulum swings, right? And also different people of different generations want different things. So you might have like a millennial who wants an interface, like a computer interface, and doesn't really care to go to the grocery store and taste the cheese and do the thing, right? I don't know. But then you have someone like me and my mom who are like, I want to taste the cheese. I want to walk around the store. I'm into cooking. I'm into this being an experience, not 100% of the time, but on certain days at certain times. Like, I think that this is an interesting and lovely thing. And Deb seems to think that this is going to be a trend that is going to grow, is that people will want to have this experiential experience. And she also commented how less and less people are shopping center store, which I found that fascinating for a number of different reasons. But so she said to herself, or asked here, fresh as a differentiator. People want a sensory experience. She sees this as a consumer trend. They're shopping less in the center aisles. They're shopping more in the fresh food aisle. So as a distributor, they realized that they needed to get into this game. And so if you watch industry news, KeHE purchased or merged with DPI. And they did that. And she talks about it very explicitly to get into the cheese game, the fresh cheese game. And it brings with them experience in cut and wrap, as she described it, right? So KeHE has, with this transaction, expanded the products that they can now deliver to their customers, and DPI brings with them experience, brand relationships, knowledge, and expertise to help them to do that. So I thought that that was really interesting. I wonder if there will be more opportunities for sort of the smaller brands and dairies and things to kind of work their way up to working with KeHE in this area. That was not, she didn't really touch on what growth there might look like. But I thought that that was interesting. The other thing she talked about was technology enhancements. People want, it was interesting because she talked about how some people just want a simple transaction, right? But it needs to be customized to a certain degree, depending on like who this person is. And she didn't really talk about specifically, or at least I didn't take any notes on it. Nothing stood out as to like the technology enhancements that like they're not interfacing with the consumer at all, right? But they do talk about technology enhancements in terms of how they serve their customer, which I'm going to hold for a couple of minutes and then talk about that, because I think that is something we want to spend a good amount of time on.
Okay.
And then the last thing was the next generation of consumers and how they are probably going to continue shopping online. They're probably going to continue shopping on social. And so how does KeHE support that kind of purchasing, right? Because if you think about
relevant.
If you think about it, if a store, like, right, you're buying online, even if you're buying online from like out here, we have Ralph's, right? Even if you go to Ralph's online store or like Walmart's online store, or you name it, online store, they're not housing that in a single like in each individual store, like location, right? So like, what does distribution look like in terms of the way technology is advancing on the consumer front? And that's something that they seem to really be thinking about. And then how does that trickle down and sort of then spread throughout the way that they're doing things and the way that they're thinking about things? So, really interesting. So then the last bit, she kind of talked about like KeHE and how they're positioned for the future. And this is where things get really juicy. So obviously specialty and natural, they drive up average basket value or average cart value in a store. We've kind of talked this over and over, like throughout her entire presentation. She expects that it's going to take more share in store. I think it's going to take more share inside of KeHE, with an emphasis on, I think, that fresh kind of like what gets sold in the outer areas. But I think what's important to know here is like, especially for good food brands, there's a cheese department, there will be jams, there will be nuts, there will be crackers, right? All of these things are part of the full experience in these outer aisle experiential places. So I think there's opportunity there.
And that is where you do see the smaller brand items, right, that are being featured right next to the fancy goat cheese or the those things.
Yeah, totally. So I think that that's a really exciting thing for brands who eventually want to, be working with KeHE or distributing on that level. The other thing she talked about was, let me find it here in my notes. She talked a lot about the investments that KeHE has made during COVID. So as I mentioned, Brandon, whose last name I did not catch, who is the former president of KeHE, he made a lot of investments during COVID, which she really applauded him for. One of those was a brand new distribution center. I think it was in Texas. They're finishing, I think, currently finishing up a distribution center in Miami. The investment in DPI, but also the way that they transport and the way that they, literally do business from a logistical standpoint. And this is where technology came in. And she talked a lot about their teams internally and how focused and smart they are in terms of technology and what they are developing so that they can use their scale and size along with technology to find ways to reduce cost, reduce lead times, and increase efficiency.
Yeah.
So those are things that are top of mind for KeHE, as they're moving forward into the future. And then she talked a little bit about building better purchasing synergies for everybody in the supply chain. So from brand to retailer, how do you improve the synergy there? And here is what I think is the most exciting thing about this entire event is something called DC Direct Connect.
Okay.
And what she says here is that this gives KeHE the ability and really the retailers the ability to get anything from anywhere, no matter what DC it's in. A DC means distribution center. They're located, around the country strategically. And to date, if you were in, let's say, the Southeast region, right? If you're in that distribution center, your product can be delivered to the retailers in that region.
Yeah.
If a retailer wants you in California, you have to be in that DC in order to then be distributed to that region. And we talk about this a lot on the podcast, the challenges and the risks involved in opening multiple DCs in order to serve a few clients in each of those areas. And that's something that Modest Coffee had talked about. It's something that lots of people are sort of talking about in the industry, and how more strategic regional growth, sort of region by region by region, and opening DCs only when you have a very sort
solid,
of what do they call it? Like an anchor store or a couple anchor stores is a very strategic and financially more sustainable way to grow. So this idea that you could be in a DC in the Southeast and that this DC Direct Connect can get your product to the customer in California has potentially huge implications for brands.
Absolutely.
I mean, it's so exciting.
Not only does it have, huge implications for brands, but I think it has huge implications for the entire distribution business model. Yes.
So what she goes on to say here is that she talks a little bit about like the hub and spoke mentality, right? And let me I'm going to look at my notes because I want to make sure to get this right. She said the hub and spoke mentality of not having to have all products in all DCs is a game changer in terms of landed costs and lead times. Yeah. So that's exactly what you said, right? Like if we don't know how big these financial implications will be, we don't know exactly what the lead time perspectives would be, because I don't know. She didn't let on to like how it would all work and how things would move around. But I don't think it's in their best interest to make things more expensive and slower. So one would think it would be the opposite, quicker and less expensive.
Yeah.
And then, I mean, to be able to essentially be a national brand, but be from in one DC.
That's a game changer.
It's a game changer. It's really exciting.
And so I think when we talk about this conversation overall, right, this entire state of the industry, at least from my perspective, and I definitely want to hear from you as well, I think one of the things that made it so interesting, if we go back to the beginning of our conversation, right, and we talk about, you were saying, let's give this woman a chance, right? Let's see what she has to say or what she's going to do. And we talked about, when you want to create change, you have to believe that change is possible. What I think was so great about this conversation was there was so much in this state of the industry that I think, you've been saying, people around the good food space have been saying, right? These are the changes that we want to see, or these are the trends that we are seeing, or this is a way we think business could be done. She addressed so many of those things. So just to hear that, someone at the level of the president of a major distribution company is seeing those things and thinking those things and is on the same track is promising.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I think, we should definitely note that, they want to double in size. So it is, their goal to grow. They, have invested in and are investing in the strategies and the platforms in order to do that. I think that, something that she talked about was being a one store solution, because they can get it all to a store. As we talked about before, kind of them being everything that their customer needs. So they want to grow. And, thinking back to my conversation with Eric from Mabel on the podcast a couple weeks ago, distributors make money by moving product. And, in case it wasn't clear in that conversation, right? Like, one of the things that is problematic for smaller brands, right? Or younger brands, is that they don't have the ability to grow big and grow fast all of the time. And that is a hindrance to the success of their relationship with a distributor like KeHE. And they're talking about ways that they are working with distributors to kind of bridge the gap between self-distribution and full-on, distribution like this, sort of like across all DCs and stuff. And I think that it is indeed interesting and exciting to hear that they within KeHE are thinking about how they can change what they are doing. Yes, to support their own aspirations and goals, right? But it also will help people on either end of the supply chain as well. So I completely agree with you that it's exciting to hear some of the things that she's saying.
Yeah.
And to think about the effects that it can have on the industry. At the end of the day, what I want and what you want and what many people here in the community want is more good food in more homes. And that means it's got to get on more shelves. Some folks want to be regional brands, but KeHE and other distributors help with regional distribution, right?
Yeah.
Others want to be national brands. And if that's the case, you need a distributor of some sort, to help you get your product across the country. And so we're driving change. We're asking for change. We're asking for conversation, transparency, right? It's not going to happen overnight.
I was just going to say that.
And I think small steps are good, and we'll keep an eye on it, and we'll keep an eye on the news and see how these things roll out.
Yeah. Yeah. Exciting stuff.
Yeah. For those of you in the community, we'll drop a link maybe in the comments to the address so that you can watch it for yourself.
Yeah, if you haven't had a chance.
Yeah, and share your thoughts below, things that maybe excited you, things that maybe you are like, I don't know, we had a couple of those moments, if you are a brand strategist, a marketing person, someone who has insights into some of the areas that Chelsea and I don't, that we kind of asked about earlier on in the video, please also share your thoughts and feedback there as well. And I think also at the same time that we are excited about this address, we also need to continue to share stories, the wins, the struggles, the realities of working with a distributor or trying to work with a distributor, because that is the way that this community and the good food revolution get stronger. Conversation, transparency, and so I guess I'll add accountability is important, right? And it's kind of sort of on us to keep them accountable. Any final thoughts
to
from you,
elevate those
Chelsea?
voices.
Yeah.
I think we said it all at this point. I thought it was a really important topic to discuss. I think it covered a lot in terms of the implications that it has on our community specifically, right, of Good Food Founders. And I can't wait to have more conversations like this in the future.
All right. Well, we'll be back live, I think, next week.
Yeah, we'll be live next Tuesday.
Amazing. We'll see you then.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye.